Overview of the current state.
Yeah. Thank you very much. I'm coming from up there. Thank you very much, Danny. Yes, so as Danny mentioned, I'll give you a quick overview of some of the activities and resources that we're currently producing within the South African Centre for Digital Language Resources. I'll start off my talk just by giving you a little bit of more information on the background of the South African context. So why we do need a centre like this, how that fits into our constitution and our language landscape, and then give you a quick overview as well of the South African research infrastructure roadmap, of which StudyLAR is a part. I'll say a little bit about our structure in terms of how we function, and also the functions that we perform within this center. And then, like Mimi mentioned, I'll give you a little bit of information on what our planning is for the medium to longer term, both for the center and for the South African context, as well as give you some demonstrations on some of the natural language processing technologies that we've already implemented, some of the resources that are already available, and perhaps some of the research opportunities that are available in South Africa at the moment. So in South Africa, we have 11 official languages. Two of them are Afrikaans and English, which are basically Germanic languages. Afrikaans is Pidgin or Dutch that developed in the late 18th and early 19th century, so 19th and 20th century. But then we also have 9 indigenous African languages. Those are isiNdebele, isiSwati, isiXhosa, and isiZulu, which are conjunctively written Nguni languages. So these are languages that are agglutinative and conjunctively written, so are very similar to Turkish, Finnish, Hungarian, where you have a large number of inflections, especially around verbs. A typical verb for one of these languages can take 1,500 to 2,500 different forms, depending on the morphemes that are attached to it. And so it has both prefixing and suffixing. And then you have the disjunctively written Sotho languages. So this is also an agglutinative language, but when it was developed, or the orthography developed in the early 20th century, they basically decided to not attach morphemes to the stems and the roots of the word. So you end up with a disjunctive writing style where the same word in conjunctively and a disjunctively written language would consist of 4 or 5 morphemes plus a stem that are separated tokens. On the one hand in the Sotho languages, and then that would be a single word in the conjunctive languages. There are also 2 other languages, Xitsonga and Tshivenda, which also are disjunctively written, but they don't form part of the Sotho group, and they're from a completely different language family than both the Sotho and the Nguni languages, which are originally West African languages. Now, what makes this challenging and interesting is that because the Constitution mandates that all of these languages be treated equally, and so if you go into any public setting, you should be able to have your first language as your language of preference in any communication that you have. So if you end up in court or you deal with a police system, you need to be able to work with people in their language of their choice. Obviously the problem with this is that you can't employ translators and interpreters in all of these situations. And so there are various initiatives by the government to facilitate technologies to help people gain access to information, whether it be through websites, apps, and so on, that would allow them to access this information in the language of their choice. In practice, though, most of the public interactions still happen in English. Although English is only the 4th largest language in South Africa, with around 9% of the people whose first language it is. most of that interaction, and it's by the default business language, the default public communication language, sorry, with the consequence that most people in South Africa are typically working in their second, third, or their fourth language even, when they're speaking English, which has serious impact on the way that they interact, how they're able to communicate, and especially in problematic areas like medicine, interactions with doctors and nurses in those kinds of environments. So on the right-hand side, there's a breakdown of the percentage of people that speak each of the languages as their first language. So isiZulu and isiXhosa are the two main languages, making up around 38%, 39% of the population. And then Afrikaans and English follow from there. So as I mentioned, there's been various HLT, NLP related research projects over the last 18 to 20 years, happening at various institutions. But even though we've been working on this for 20 years, all of these languages are still considered under-resourced. So because we're a relatively small community, funding has been fairly limited, and there's also a data shortage just in terms of what is available digitally. So a typical African language corpus would consist of 1.5, maybe 2 or 3 million tokens, which is not enough to really do proper statistical analysis, build machine learning tools, and the like on them. There are initiatives to build larger annotated data sets, and I'll show a couple of examples later on, where we have an 11-way parallel annotated data set that's available for part of speech, lemma, morphological information, phrase chunking, and named entity recognition, for instance. But this is a challenge because most of the technologies and the advancements that are taking place in NLP and HLT require massive amounts of data. So gigaword corpus is typical in most of the European languages, or many of the European languages at least, which means that you can do statistical modeling on those languages that aren't possible in these languages. So in many instances, we need to take different approaches, integrate various resources, and try to simulate actual data, which is, causes its own problems, but enables you to, in some cases, improve the technologies. And then, as I briefly mentioned, there's also a fairly limited knowledge base that's actively working on. So although there are 5 or 6 institutions that are working on these technologies, it's usually a group of 5 to 15 people. So within the country, we're probably looking at somewhere between 40 and 60 people that actively work on NLP-related challenges. And because of the nature of the languages, the sheer number of languages, that becomes a big challenge. Most of the funding that you get is for projects that need to focus on all 10 or 11 languages at any given time, which means that there's a lot of horizontal scaling and not so much vertical scaling. So you can't really spend time going into depth on a particular problem. So you can't spend 5 years just working on, let's say, part of speech tagging for isiZulu, which is technically needed, but there's just no funding for it. Luckily, the Department of Science and Technology got on board with a worldwide movement to set up technical infrastructures that support researchers, which is basically putting in place a strategic medium to long work framework to support research communities, research development, and make facilities and resources and services available to the broader research community in order to foster growth in these different communities. Now, this is a larger infrastructure, so the infrastructure roadmap is a larger initiative, includes 13 different RIs, something like there's a space program, there are geography or oceanography research infrastructures, genome infrastructure. And Cellular is one of those infrastructures, similar to the Common Language Resource Infrastructure in Europe, which only focuses on language and digital humanities research and resources. It's also, of the 13 RIs, the only one that's actually focused on the humanities. So Cellular is basically set up to stimulate and enable digital research and development in the South African languages on a more sustainable level with consistent funding, as well as providing the type of infrastructure and support that many researchers that are moving into the field require in order to be able to work in the field. We have 4 main areas that we're focusing on. So the development of digital language resources and research data. That can be any type of data across all the different modalities. And then also automatic analysis and processing tools, some of which I'll show you in a little bit in the demonstration side. Then we also have a fairly large-scale digitalization effort. There are a number of works that have been published in the African languages that would support, the increase in the number of, or the amount of data that's available for corpora, for instance. But there's also a lot of research that happened in the 60s and 70s on various of these languages, but the data is still in a format that, or non-digital format, analog format. And so actually digitizing those, transferring the transcriptions would make a relatively large new chunk of data available in the medium to short term. Then where my job mostly comes in is in the management and distribution of resources. So making sure that all of the data sets that are developed follow the standards and procedures that are required in order for it to be useful in the research environments, and ensuring that that's openly and fairly distributed, since most of it is funded by the government, that we follow open data principles and make everything as freely available as possible. Then we also have a large chunk of work around enabling academic scholarship. So since we're a relatively small group of people in the country working on this, we do want to involve all of the universities and expand the knowledge base of people that are working on these different languages with different modalities. And so we're doing a lot of awareness, but also encouraging people to get involved in digital linguistic and literary studies, as well as digital humanities more in general. And we have various avenues that we support this, and I'll get to some of that in a second. So Cellular is set up as a hub and spoke model. The hub itself, where I'm employed, is situated in Northwest University in Potchefstroom, but we also have 5 nodes that are currently participating. And they each have a different area of specialization. So we have a digitalization node that purely focuses on digitizing different resources, using tools to automatically extract dictionary data, for instance, from data or from scanned versions of dictionaries, so that you have structured data that you can include in online access dictionaries. The University of South Africa focuses on some semantics and terminology, so they're busy with building WordNets for the 11 languages, which would allow for additional semantic processing. And terminology is really important because many of the languages, because of the historic context of South Africa, weren't developed properly over the last 50 years, and it's all for 50 years prior to 1994. And so it's not possible to go to a university and learn engineering in isiZulu because the terminology doesn't exist. And so there's a large push, especially in the education sphere, for making terminology available, and that development then takes place across the country, but is centralized at the University of South Africa to some extent. The ASALDA group is an interinstitutional group that works with language development and teaching. So as a first step at all of the universities across South Africa, you have an introductory language learning class that all students need to take called academic literacy, which basically teaches you how to read and write pseudo-academic, or at least academic-like content. But especially for people coming from rural areas, it's very difficult to read handbooks and journal articles and the like. And so they go through this process to customize them to the surroundings of the university and what would be expected of them. They're currently working on developing a multilingual, multi-L2 language academic literacy corpus. And so we hope that from that we can establish where people are having problems when they're learning English as their method of instruction and when they're writing English especially. The Human Language Technology Group at the CSIR works on speech resources and technologies. So I'll get to their specific project in a second, but they've been involved for 15 years in developing text-to-speech and automatic speech recognition engines for the South African languages using various modalities and techniques. And then my previous job was with the Center for Text Technology at the Northwest University, where we develop automatic analysis tools, data, and technologies for all of these South African languages. Some of those I will give you some examples a little later on. And then we're also, the reason I'm currently in Europe is to establish cooperation and partnerships with international agencies like CLARIN, the European Language Resource Association in Paris, and then the Linguistic Data Consortium in the US. So the fact that these institutions already exist means that some of our ramp-up work, we can use the technologies, adapt them to our specific situations, but that we don't need to start from scratch with all the infrastructure work that's necessary to support researchers from various backgrounds. So with our current nodes that I just mentioned, we're in a proactive effort to extend these language resources and get more data available for people to do more in-depth research. And so there's just a summary of the 5 projects that are currently running. As I mentioned, there's a digitization effort to build 11 digital text and speech corpora from existing non-digital resources, the WordNet and Terminology, Learner Corpora. For the speech nodes, they're currently looking at methods of automatically collecting speech data from broadcast media. So one of the only viable methods of getting enough data to be able to model language, or spoken language at least properly, is to harvest data from radio stations, from news bulletins, and from the interviews that they have on these news bulletins. Unfortunately, those are typically not transcribed or not available, so they're using semi-automatic transcription and alignment of those data sets in order to extend them so that we can start having a production line where we can get hundreds of hours of speech rather than what we currently have, which is on a 100-hour speech corpus. It will take multiple years to develop that. And that's mostly due to funding and expertise. And then at the Center for Text Technology, they're working on extending some text corpora for the conjunctively written languages. So at the moment, with the conjunctively and the disjunctively written languages, you often need to take different approaches to how you process them. So the morphology of these conjunctively written languages are relatively regular, so you can still use rule-based systems to relatively accurately describe them. The problem is that it becomes untenable to maintain those types of systems in the long term, and the processing speed does go down significantly. So they're hoping by extending the corpus to around 100,000 annotated instances that they can more accurately model these languages statistically, get part of speech taggers and morphological analyzers that are moving closer towards what you typically get for English or even Afrikaans. The reason they don't work on the disjunctive languages is that for most of those types of technologies, the precision or F-scores are already in the low to mid-90s, so that would take significantly more data in order to improve them, and it might be better to spend more time trying additional statistical techniques. Then we also do digitization support to external institutions, and then the really boring stuff which goes around providing assistance with best practices for digitalization and software development, data standards, all of the things that lawyers are interested in, and making sure that we are able to provide these resources freely but without infringing on copyright. One of the other initiatives we have is an open call for research development or resource development and research projects. And this falls across both the domain of language resource and technology development, but also any aspect of digital humanities. And so currently there are 5 projects that have already been approved. The first is an early childhood language acquisition project that looks at 5 different languages where they track children across the first 3 years and how they acquire these languages by what are the first things that they learn, but then also a lot of metadata about who their caretakers or caregivers are during those early stages, because lots of the time that's not necessarily your parent, it may be your grandparents or your brothers or sisters, depending on the family structure, and that influences how children also then learn language when they start acquiring. The second project is an eyewitness account statement analysis project, also at the University of Cape Town, where they have police statements on certain events that took place, as well as the legal proceedings that are associated with those statements. And then they have simulated events where they also get statements from participants. The participants don't know that they're in this situation and the event happens next to something else that they're busy with, but then they're asked to provide a full statement on that. And they're going to investigate how accurate those account statements are and whether you can model that from the actual statement itself to predict how accurate or what's the likelihood of the accuracy of the statement. Then we also have a historical journal digitization project, so the VOC, which is the Dutch company that's landed in South Africa, have extensive journals from the 1652 when they landed through to the mid-1800s. And for this, we're digitizing and transcribing 10 years worth of data. Then there's a collection of health resources in South African languages, what is currently available, and some initiatives to extend that. And there's also an eye tracking for subtitling project where they look at how people actually read, because there's a disjunct between how people read English, for instance, how much time they spend reading English and looking at visuals versus how they read and speak or process the visuals in their native language. Usually one study at least found that there's a negative correlation, so in their mother tongue, in which you'd expect them to be more fluent in reading, they actually spend more time on the subtitles than on the visuals itself. Then as far as the management and distribution goes, like I said, long-term digital preservation with open access. So we have set up a digital data repository where you have an index of all of the resources that are currently available, all of the resources that are developed. And then the two important things is that we have persistent identifiers available. And there's a drive throughout many areas, but especially in linguistics and the humanities, in starting to actually reference any data sets that you use. And so that gives more recognition to the people who built the resources themselves, but it's not necessarily always a requirement by journals, but there is a movement to start doing that, so that whenever you do publish on a particular data set, that data set is then available and other people can reproduce your research. Then we also have some technology portals available, which I'll demonstrate in a second. And then the legal issues related to resources, which is usually around copyright and what you're able to do with the data. So I won't say too much more about the open calls, but we are also providing significant support for training activities. So running workshops, having visiting scholars come over in order to reskill many of the people that are currently working in these fields of study, but then also the students that are going through our universities at the moment that don't necessarily have access to these types of knowledge and skills because the lecturers don't necessarily are that actively involved. And so, maybe for instance, gave a couple of workshops in South Africa on digital humanities and how that can be applied to different focus areas, with the idea of starting to build a community of researchers so that we can fit in better with people like the European digital humanities community, as well as the worldwide digital humanities community. So we're currently only in the setup phase. We've basically been up and running for just a little more than a year. And so there's still a lot of work that needs to be done based on the trip that I'm currently doing or improving our technologies, some updates there, the integration into other infrastructures, and also the integration of our technologies into tool chains that would allow researchers that aren't necessarily that technically inclined to be able to still do the processing, get the statistics, do the types of research and answer the research questions that they want in an interactive and easy way. And then also to allow people to actually process and use their own data sets rather than just focusing on the stuff that we currently have available. That's basically where we stand. I'd like to go over to the demonstrations in a second, but perhaps first ask if there are any questions from the room. Nothing? Okay. Makes it easier or worse. So this is basically just our landing page where everything that we offer is available. There's requests for workshops. The resource catalog is where we host all of our data sets. There's some technologies available that I'll show in a second. And then we have some procedures and guideline documentation. So most of what we have available is available from our research tab. And so in the resource catalog, we have a variety of data sets. That's anything related to language or digital humanities. It includes some tool chains, some tool sets, as well as then pure data sets. So something like this Swana Test Suite and TreeBank is a TreeBank data set that is purely data, while something like CTEX Tools is a corpus analysis environment, but where you can also do automatic processing on all of these languages with on your own data sets, although that is all offline. There's also TTS corpora, automatic speech recognition corpora that you can use to build either TTS or ASR systems. And I think in total, yeah, so we have 213 different data sets and tools that are currently available across these 10 languages. So it's not that we have nothing, but like I said, most of these are still relatively small, but they're also fairly well distributed across all of the South African languages. Dutch that you see there is because there's a project which developed Afrikaans, parallel Afrikaans and Dutch, semantically annotated data sets for compounds. That was compounds, right? Yeah. For compounds, and so that's also included. And we're not limited, although we're focusing mostly on South African languages, we do also have some Western African languages. I'm sure somewhere in here you have Yoruba, which is a language that is spoken in Nigeria. And so, as part of our initiative, although we're starting in South Africa, we hope to expand through the rest of Africa because there are somewhere in the region of about 3,500 languages that are spoken throughout Africa. Many of them would be almost impossible to document in this way, but there would certainly be some languages that we would be able to do that for. We also have an online search environment, corpus analysis environment, where with some, please do not fall over. We can basically do keyword and context. No, that didn't work at all. Oh, it's because I can't spell. So you can do basic keyword and context searches. There's some limitization, so the limitizers have already been implemented here. You can see larger contexts and the like. There's also some statistical functionality for extracting word list, frequency lists, grouping documents by their content and surrounding context. Yes?
Just a question out of interest. Is the language of the website only English, or is it also various languages?
It is in various languages. So, for instance, I will now not be able to follow this, but, well, I should still be able to follow most of it. But yeah, so most of what we have available is in English, mainly available in English, but we are transitioning. We hope to have everything available in all 11 languages by January of next year. Because, yeah, that is something that's important, and that's something that will happen on an ongoing basis.
Because it's sometimes a remark I get from my students in South Africa, they are looking in the library, looking for certain resources, and the only language they can access that database is English. And if their fourth language is English, their first language is Zulu and so on, then they get into difficulties making a search precise so that they can find what. But you are working on that.
Yeah. No. So it's difficult and makes everything more expensive to do that. But everything, yeah. So because of the mandate that we have, we do need to make everything available in all of these languages. But we also do want to make it available, for instance, in English, so that if Medu or myself want to do actual research in isiZulu, for instance, that we can still access the data. Because there's one of the other examples I'll give is only available in Afrikaans, for instance. So if you're English and you don't have an Afrikaans background, then you can't technically access any of the information.
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, so, and this software was partly developed by someone else in the room. So this is an adaptation of an existing European initiative. We're also investigating at the moment something where we can have parallel corpora available, because there is a limited number of parallel corpora available for these languages. We're also looking at making speech search available online, because that's something else that we've been requested. so, but for the moment, it's only available for monolingual text corpora. Then two more, oh, I didn't even open this, sorry, I just want to get this. Please do load. Yeah. So at the beginning of this year, we also made available web services for the list of technologies that are available there on the right-hand side. So this is a very simple web interface just to allow other types of researchers to actually process the data as well. But these are available through RESTful calls so that they can be processed online by other sites. And so for all of these, for all 11, no, for 10 of the 11 languages, for 10 of the 11 languages, we have these available. We didn't build language technologies, for instance, for English, because many other people are already working on English, and we don't need to focus on that. But there are, optical character recognition engines for all of these languages, which allows us to do digitization more efficiently, part of speech and taggers and so on. All of them are now available online and can be used interactively by a number of different types of users as well. Then one other flagship project that wasn't funded by the Department of Science and Technology, but that's been in development for a couple of years, is the development of parallel corpora for machine translation systems. And so this is currently only available for 5 languages. So the languages in those drop down, but the additional 5 of those languages are being developed at the moment. They at the moment still use the Moses statistical machine translation kit, but there is research ongoing on how to apply deep learning in resource-scarce environments especially for morphologically complex languages like isiZulu and isiXhosa. And so that combination of scenarios, now this is off again, gives you access to a number of different types of research topics and research interests. This is then also available as a web service. This is again, a relatively simple interactive environment, but this is also integrated into, not Trados, one of the open source translation environments, so that you can have the Ojumatu translations next to the Google Translate translations, and you can have it in a single environment where if you're doing large-scale translation, that just speeds up that process significantly. Then, what's 2 more things? So I'm not plugged, I am plugged into should be able to play. So this is a demonstration of a text-to-speech engine for the South African languages. There are male and female voices for each of those languages. This demonstration basically just generates a WAV file that
bonke abantu bazalwa bekhululekile belingana ngesithunzi nangamalungelo bahlanganiswe umcabango nangunembeza futhi kufanele baphathane ngomoya wobuntu.
So that's still, as far as text-to-speech goes, not perfect, but it is a step towards giving people access to information that they can't necessarily read, which is also still a significant problem, especially in the rural areas of South Africa. And so the CSIR, with this Q-Fluency project, are working with a school for the deaf, school for the blind, to provide the TTS to them in book form so that they gain access to reading books, but then also in some medical institutions where data is only available in written format so that they can actually listen to the data. One of the things that's most interesting and most difficult for these African languages are that they're tonal languages as well. So they don't have stress, but they have tone internal, similar to what Chinese does, although not quite as complex as that. But modeling tone is an unsolved problem, and is a very difficult problem to solve in order to get it to sound as natural as it needs to be. Then the last thing I'd like to show you is an Afrikaans initiative, and that's not our initiative, but we are associated with Viva, which basically is a language resource portal for Afrikaans, but with a different focus, so not a research focus. And they give access to dictionary data. They also have corpus environments, and then they are in cooperation with the Dutch Language Union on building an Afrikaans grammar that's linked to Dutch and Frisian, so that you can do interactive research between the three languages, link examples, the types of pronunciation, and so on that happens in these three languages. And all of this is mostly, like 90% of it's available for free, where they've collected 46 different dictionaries, for instance. This, for instance, is the word "sterretjie," which is little star, and is available in, I'm going to guess, around 10 different dictionaries, everything from IT dictionary. Sterretjie can also be an asterisk. It should be a kind of bird as well. I don't see the bird one. But in any case, there's a thesaurus, and all of this information is then available to language practitioners and a different audience than we're serving at the current stage. I think that's everything I have, unless there are any other questions. Anyone? Yes.
I was wondering, you're currently solely focusing on the South African languages, right?
Yeah.
Are you looking forward to expand, for example, to more Southern countries, or more?
Yeah. So because our funding, and this is purely funding related, because our funding comes from the South African government, they expect us to work mostly and fund mostly South African projects or South African language projects. There is, within the SADC region, Botswana, they also speak a variant of Setswana, and they also have data sets available, so we are already coordinating with them to a certain degree to get access to some of their data. The same in Zimbabwe, they speak a variant of Setsonga, either Setsonga or Chivenga, sorry, I'm not 100% sure. But getting data and including them. But the idea is that we will develop into Africa as well. We will also give support for any other African language in terms of distributing the legal matters and standardization and so on. We probably won't at the moment fund directly development of those resources in those countries, just because our funding is also limited, although it's more significant than it was, and there's still a lot of work that needs to happen just in the South African languages. Thank you. Yes?
I just learned a new word, slim form.
Oh, yes.
Now, my question is this: I know that Afrikaans people are very keen in creating new words. A tunnel is a duikweg, and a caravan is a sleurhut, etc. But are other languages in South Africa also trying that? Like I know in Zulu they simply use the names of the days, but from English.
So they, and this is problematic because I'm not prescriptive, and so there's a lot of loan words that enter into these African languages. They get, they still follow the morphology rules. So they take the stem of an English word, for instance, and then still apply the morphemes that are in them. So it still remains relevant. But there is a drive to move away from that of just using loan words. But there are, for instance, Botswana, the word for a slight change, and it's spelled Bhuka.